We devoted all of our time talking about the manuscript evidence in the form of the Muratorian Fragment, also known as the Muratorian Canon. And it is originally a Greek document, approximately 170 AD, possibly earlier. There's some more liberal scholars that try to place it later, even as late as the 5th century, the 4th century, the 300s. But there's just too much evidence that it's too early for that, especially as we read in the document last week in reference to the Roman emperor that is mentioned, and it says in very recent in their time. And so the time frame would take us certainly to the 2nd century and no later than the 2nd century. The amazing thing about it, and those that just received it, the 85 lines, and that's why you have the numbers. And I'm saying this because we have a good 5 or 6 people here tonight that didn't go through this last week. But you'll see that there are numbers in parentheses. And what this originally is a Greek document. This is about lines, I think, something I forget, something like 35 or 68 or something like that, the copy of the Muratorian Fragment. But the fragment has 85 lines. It is missing some of the front end of it, then comes to an abrupt end, which means that they're pretty certain that there was more to it than what they have on the 85th line. It is not simply a list of the 24 out of the 27 books of the New Testament, but what the fragment does, and the author is unknown. It was discovered by a fellow by the name of Martyr in the 15th century. But what this does, this fragment does declare, is that the author makes mention, again, of 24 out of the 27 books of the New Testament in the 2nd century, which shows us one thing, that there was an understanding of what the New Testament canon already was. Those that tried to endorse, and I didn't really talk about this too much last week, why I thought in the review I wanted to make mention of it tonight, was that there is the idea, especially espoused by Catholicism and others within certain circles of Christianity, that it was the Catholic Church, the developing Catholic Church, that established the canon in 325 AD. There was a significant event that did take place in 325 AD. Does anybody remember from their history of what took place in 325? Bryce?
Constantine converted.
Well, now that is true, that during that period of time that Constantine, who was the emperor, had converted shortly before that to Christianity, which led about to this event in 325, and a creed came out even, and that creed was called the Nicene. That's right, the Nicene Creed. And in the Council of Nice, or Nice, however you want to say that, but in the Council of Nice, there are some that believe, well, it was at that time that the canon was being developed and then officially declared. Now, just because the Catholic Church might officially declare something at some particular time doesn't mean that it was not already understood or being practiced or believed. I think one of the greatest evidences of that has to do with worship on Sunday, the first day of the week. There's also a time an edict was made by a pope much later on that declaring officially that Sunday was the day of worship as opposed to the Sabbath. Now, yes, a pope made that declaration, but did we need a declaration of a pope to know about the first day of the week? Of course not, because we have the New Testament information. Well, in like manner, that when it comes to the canon, there may be certain claims made by individuals that the Catholic Church determined what the canon was in 325, but we have way too much manuscript evidence to show that the canon was already being understood, and the Muratorian Fragment is a fantastic example of that. I went ahead and in the last couple of days have done some more research. I'm not going to go into all of it, but some more research, and found some more documents on the Muratorian Fragment and some of the debate that takes place. But it's just really fascinating. We had a good discussion last week concerning that. Now, leaving that, and as we're still looking at manuscript evidence, but now we want to look at some of the characters. In Lesson 5, on page 29, Lesson 5, page 29, I want you to read with me. And in the second paragraph, where it begins with the name Ignatius. So, page 29, and the second paragraph. Now, again, in some time in which he wrote these letters, and that's why the 70 to 110 is a period of time when he wrote these 7 letters. He was born in about 35 AD, but the significant part of his writing was 70 to up to his death at 110. So that's not really a discrepancy. It's just this is showing when he was doing his writing. But this is interesting in 35 because if Ignatius being born in 35 AD, that really has him being born during what period of time when we look at New Testament history? I mean, it's apostolic time, and only probably just a few short years after the death, burial, resurrection, ascension of Christ and the establishment of the church. Even if we are conservative and say that that's 30 AD, that's only 5 years. Some believe it could be 32 or 33. But he was born at a very interesting time. Not that he was witness to Christ, because he's born a little too late for that, barely. And besides that, you've got to grow up. But the point is that he was born during the apostolic period of time. We're going to look at these, and when you look at this page 29, and as we're going to be talking about Ignatius, Justin Martyr, Ironies, the Bishop of Lines, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Hippolytus, and Eusebius. Again, we do not refer to, just as we do not refer to the Muratorian fragment itself as being some kind of a manuscript. It was a manuscript, but not that as though it was some kind of a manuscript that was given by the inspiration of God. No. But it gives to us some historical verification that becomes very important of what was extant, what was available. And by the same token, that when we talk about the patristics, or when you look at literature and biblical literature and this religious history, period of time, that sometimes they're referred to as patristics or as the church fathers. Obviously, when you look at the word patristic, what comes to mind to you in that word patristic? Yeah, like a patriarch, even the patriarchal, because, pater having to do with a father. And so we understand, and we're never going to refer to them as the church fathers as the sense of calling a man by a religious title, as though it's Father Ignatius or something like that. No, Jesus even addressed that. But from a historical standpoint, these individuals that some of them were born near the end of the apostolic time. Some of them were actually disciples of some individuals who were disciples of the apostles, including John, the Apostle John. And so they do offer, again, some great historical value. Now, we're going to be looking at men that have lots of different kinds of views, and some of them that, quite frankly, became a part of the problem as far as when it comes to doctrine and to the corruption of the pure gospel of Jesus Christ. I want to be crystal clear about that. And so we use them, we refer to them in this study, not because they are some type of authority on the Scripture per se. They certainly are not inspired, and many of them, again, were involved in that, what was already going on in abandoning many of the principles of New Testament Christianity, especially when it came to the organization of the church, to the autonomy of the church, of what an eldership or the bishopric was to be, the presbyters, and many of them had become a part of that problematic situation. But the reason that I want to refer to them is because we know when they were born, basically, when they lived, when they died, and we also know that they were prolific writers, and in the writings that how many times they referred to New Testament books, and some Old Testament books, by the way, too, but to New Testament books already in existence and considered as being inspired books of the apostles. Do you see what I'm saying? They become of great value for historical verification. you study them, and you can go, and one of the documents that I like, sources that I use, is in reference to the development of the canon in the New Testament, and they put out a terrific amount of information of all of these patristics, and you can read biographies about them, what they wrote, a gist of what they wrote, why they wrote it, and just a great amount of information. So that's what we're going to do here. So when we start with Ignatius of Antioch, and he did write 7 letters in which he quoted from 18 different books of the New Testament. Now that's interesting because, again, the bulk of his writing is done basically from about 70 AD up to his death in 110 AD, but he quotes from 18 different books of the New Testament. There are 27 books in the New Testament, so by quoting 18, he is quoting better than half of the books that are represented in the New Testament. All right, and what's also interesting about some of these fellows is that they were born often to families that were not Christian. In fact, many of them had pagan backgrounds. We think about their Grecian background, and would later become Christian, would later be exposed to Christianity. And so Ignatius did serve as a bishop in Antioch of Syria. Remember, in our New Testament, the book of Acts, we have 2 Antiochs. Antioch of Syria, and Syria, which is in the news a lot right now, right? North of Israel, north of that area. But if you go even north and west of that, in what is modern-day Turkey, then there is Antioch of Pisidia. So not to be confused, he was one of the bishops, had become bishop of Antioch of Syria. In these 7 writings that he had, very major writings, Ignatius, again, is referring to several books. But what is interesting is that there are some other books that were available at this time, too, that are not a part of the canon. And we've talked about some of those books, and some of those were Gnostic and so forth. And Ignatius, like many of these individuals, noted that those books should not be viewed as being inspired and should never be read publicly within the congregation, within the assembled church. But while he does not refer to these older Christian writings, these books by name, and that's interesting. Why do you suppose, think about when he's living, why do you suppose even when he's writing his letters and his books, because he's writing these treatises, as it were, and he's writing from 70 to 110, why do you suppose that he doesn't say, as Paul wrote in the book of Romans? Ellen, go ahead, take a stab at it. You're mouthing something.
Well, at that point, there wasn't a book. There were letters.
And while there were letters to Romans, they had not necessarily been identified as yet as the book of Romans. It may have been known as a letter that Paul has written, but we just so commonly talk about the book of Romans, the book of 1 Thessalonians, the book of Acts. And these fellows who, by the way, acknowledged the 4 Gospels, and that Luke was not only the author of the Gospel of Luke, but they also all acknowledged that Luke was the author of what other book, obviously? The book of Acts. But it wasn't being called the book of Acts yet. We call it the book of Acts, and in time it would be. But they will refer to the second treatise of Luke written to Theophilus. Isn't that marvelous? I think that's just wonderful information. He does, though, have direct quotations from Matthew, from Luke, from Acts, from Romans, from 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians. And so in Ignatius's book, and he named some because he wrote a letter. He wrote a letter, a very long letter to the church at Ephesus. But in his letter to the church at Ephesus, he does quotations out of Matthew 12, out of Matthew 19. Then he writes a letter to the Thessalonians. And in this book that he's referring to as Ephesians, it was his Ephesus document, but he writes this and he even quotes Paul out of that. In fact, he says to them, quote, "Keep on praying," in the translation. Well, what is 1 Thessalonians 5:17? How do we normally quote that in our English today? Pray without ceasing. But this what's fascinating to me is how an individual this early on already had access to many of these letters and these manuscripts. He quotes from Colossians 1:23. He quotes 1 Corinthians 1:20. 1 Corinthians 4:1, 1 Corinthians 9, Romans 4. I mean, there are so many things that he quotes from, Ignatius. And again, in the book of Acts, and the understanding that the book of Acts was written by Luke. And so this becomes very valuable information. Interesting, so early on. And Ignatius of Antioch. Okay. Anybody have any other thoughts or comments? I don't know if anybody's ever done any. Yes, Dennis.
I was just thinking the letters that he wrote to the churches in which he's quoting, you would think then that the churches also have the manuscripts from which he's quoting from.
Indeed, they, in all likelihood, they did. And we get that sense even from Paul's letter to the Colossians that was also to be given to the Laodiceans. And then when we look at the 7 letters to the 7 churches that were to be copied and distributed in Revelation 2 and 3, we get the real sense that these letters were copied over and over and over and distributed amongst congregations throughout the Roman Empire. Yeah, absolutely. Maya?
So that was my question. How did he come to know all of this? He wasn't necessarily a member of the congregations then, or was he?
Oh no, he became a Christian. And then he wrote these letters to after he became a Christian. And that's what he's dealing with. In fact, what he was really dealing with, by the way, when you look, in fact, I'll give you an example. What he's really dealing with, for example, when he wrote to his letter to the Smyrna, the church at Smyrna, and he wrote to the church at Smyrna, he quotes from Luke 24. Tell me if you could pick up the quotation part. He's going to quote right from Luke 24. But he writes, "For myself, I am convinced and believe that even after the resurrection, he was in the flesh," speaking of Christ. "Indeed, when he came to Peter and his friends, he said to them, 'Take hold of me, touch me, and see that I am not a bodiless ghost.' And they at once touched him and were convinced, clutching his body and his very breath. For this reason they despised death itself and proved its victors." He has taken that right from Luke 24:39. Almost verbatim. And so, but what he was doing, what was the purpose? Is that he's trying to confirm Jesus Christ, his resurrection, and that he was resurrected in fleshly bodily form. Was not a ghost. Ellen?
Oh, what Maya said made me think too. He's of Antioch, so he's a Christian in Antioch.
Yes.
But he has access to all of these other letters that he's quoting as he writes to other people. So if he quotes from Corinthians, he's got to have access to that Corinthian letter.
And by the way, yeah, that's right.
Luke,
And by the way, think about it. He's a Christian in Antioch. What relevance does Antioch of Syria have to the Apostle Paul? That's where he began his evangelistic journeys, where they began and ended. Until we get to the third one, it ended differently. But Antioch of Syria very much becomes an important center, if you will. We know it was a congregation with elders. Acts 15 proves that there were elders at the church at Antioch. Now think about when he was living. Think about when Paul was in his ministry. You've got that time period there. It's after Paul's death that he begins to write letters. Paul dies, we are relatively sure, Paul dies in about 67, no later than the spring of 68 AD. He becomes very prolific in his writing from about 70 to 110 in Antioch. What access do you think that he might have to Pauline letters? It would be huge.
they've been collected and there's been more copies than just
Right.
Paul.
Right. Very fascinating, isn't it? Let's move on. Unless somebody else had anything else. Hoyt, did I see your hand a moment ago? No. All right. Then next I want us to think about, as you move now to the chart, Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr had began his life as a pagan, reared in Jewish environment, but was very paganistic, as many of the Jews had become. In fact, he had studied both Stoic and Platonic philosophy in the city of Ephesus, which today is, of course, in Selçuk, Turkey. But he converted to Christianity in about 130 AD. He was born around 110, died 165. He wrote the first apology sent to the Roman Emperor Antonius Pius, and his argument against the persecution of Christians. Don't forget that what was going on, again, when you look at the date, and with the initiation of great persecution at the end of the first century, under an emperor by the name of, at the end of the first century, what was his name? That's it, Domitian. Domitian, remember, Nero had already died. Then they went through 4 emperors, and there was a little bit of kind of a rest for a while after the Flavian dynasty. But then, with Domitian, it brought about a greater persecution that was made against the Christians. And so, by the first part of the 2nd century, persecution was being severe. The Colosseum was newly constructed, by the way. The Colosseum was built late in the 1st century, and they were already doing what? They were already having Christians, throwing the Christians into the Colosseum with wild animals being tore apart as sport. All right? And so he writes this important argument against the persecution of Christians, making an appeal to Antonius Pius. Okay? He becomes this Christian and does this, and after a few years he moved to Rome, and he actually founded a school there, and he was met with vehement opposition by a philosopher of Crescens, a cynic, whose antagonism made Justin determined to compose this apology, because I tell you what, it had become such a popular thing in the Roman Empire to severely persecute Christians. And anybody that's trying to advance Christian, he's establishing a school, and the school was for the purpose of teaching Christian ideals and educating people by virtue of Christian ideals. And so, sometime later, after he does this apology to Antonius Pius, then he published what was called the Dialogue with Trypho the Jew, and a shorter second apology was addressed to the Senate, and apparently after the accession. And tell me if this name makes sense to you. Marcus Aurelius. And was a very, very popular, well-known emperor that actually had a degree of decency to him. And that's about 161. And then a few years later, Justin was denounced to the Roman prefect, and as subversive, and he was condemned to death. And there are actually authentic records of his martyrdom that have survived. There are records of his martyrdom when he was put to death. He also doesn't make a practice of quoting the New Testament by name, those writings again saying the book of, but in so much of his writings he's quoting from. In summary, there's evidence that Justin Martyr considered these books of spiritual value. All 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and one of the first, and this is important, one of the first to believe that what was a part of the canon was important was the Apocalypse. We know it as what? The book of Revelation. And so he would quote from the book of Revelation as well, this revelation given to John the Apostle. And so Justin Martyr serves a very valuable place as well in history and to acknowledging several of the writings of the New Testament and quoting a great deal from all 4 Gospels. He quotes, I had some examples here, in the birth of Jesus, when he wrote in his dialogues, from Matthew 2:1, he says, when a star rose in heaven at the time of Jesus' birth, as recorded in the memoirs of his apostles, the Magi from Arabia, recognizing the sign by this, came and worshipped him. And he took his information right from the gospel account of Matthew. Luke 22, and talked about in the memoirs, the Gospels, which I have said were drawn up by the apostles and their followers, it is recorded that sweat fell like drops of blood while Jesus was praying and saying, "If it be possible, let this cup pass." He's quoting that verbatim. Justin Martyr in the Gospel of John, in his first apology in John 3:3, he says, Christ also said, "Unless you are born again, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." I had Tim present a little bit, didn't you, Tim, a couple of months ago. I had material about yea thick, and that all of the patristics almost all refer to the discussion between Jesus and Nicodemus in John 3. And by the way, all of the patristics, when Jesus said, "Unless you were born of water," they all acknowledge that being born of water referred to what? Baptism. Baptism. And then Justin Martyr in the Revelation of John, in his dialogues, he says, "Moreover, also among us a man named John, one of the apostles of Christ, prophesied in a revelation made to him that those who have believed in our Christ will spend 1,000 years in Jerusalem." So what kind of a view is he holding? Like many did. A very premillennial view, and that hereafter in general and in short, eternal resurrection and judgment will all likewise take place. A lot of them had kind of a millennial view during this period of time. Interesting. Justin Martyr. Then we would move on to Ironies of Lines, and was born around 130 AD, died around 202, just the first part of the 3rd century. Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp. A lot of information, verifiable information, and that he was a direct student of Polycarp, who in turn, Polycarp was a student or disciple of whom? John, the Apostle John, contemporary, and had studied with John in Ephesus. He recognized the 4 Gospels, and he spoke from 21 of the 27 New Testament books. And he was one of the first who really, because of all these other books that had come out that were Gnostic writings, and he was another one that exposed Gnosticism for what it was and said that these Gnostic writings, were not to be read in the assembled church. And so, but he had become an elder or a presbyter at Lyons. All right. Regarding the New Testament canon, one finds in his what was called Adversus Heresis, that is his exposure of the heretics. Okay. He gives quotations from all of the books of the New Testament, with the exception of Philemon, 2 Peter, 3 John, and Jude. But he quotes from every other book of the New Testament. And I have numerous examples of that, like I have of the others. And if anybody ever wants a copy of this or go online to read this, you can, because I'm telling you, I've got lots of information if you want to do that. And but I have several examples of that. But what's very interesting to me that I want to share before we move on, that when it comes to Irenaeus or the Pauline epistles, that according to the information that is given and what is found, the frequencies of quotations and allusions to the Pauline epistles in his Adversus Heresis are given. He quotes 84 times from Romans, 102 times allusions to 1 Corinthians, 18 times to 2 Corinthians, 27 times to Galatians, 37 times to Ephesians, 13 times to Philippians, 18 times to Colossians, 2 times in 1 Thessalonians, 9 times in 2 Thessalonians, 5 times in 1 Timothy, 5 times in 2 Timothy, 4 times in Titus. The only Pauline epistle he does not quote from is Philemon. Is the little 1-chapter book of Philemon. He acknowledges James, that there are 2 possible allusions to James in Adversus Heresis in his writing. And anyway, really fascinating. And then I've got this one other thing too. Regarding the New Testament canon, in his Adversus Heresis quotations, I actually have the list, a really remarkable list of incredible quotations from Matthew 3:16, Mark 3:10, on and on and on, where the specific quotations that he has done. It's fascinating to me again because we're talking about 2nd and going to the 3rd century, but how early this still is in having this much availability to these books in the New Testament. That's what I want us really to see in this. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Moving on to Clement of Alexandria. By the way, these names have been thrown out there. Have we heard of most of at least heard of these names, most of them? I think we've heard of them, most of them. Clement of Alexandria, a very controversial individual. He was referred to as a Christian apologist. The biggest criticism that was given to him by his peers and even people after the fact of historians was that sometimes some of these fellows weren't really known to maybe do their homework as well as they should have, and some of their, their historical facts and whatnot. Sometimes, and I've read some things about Clement of Alexandria when it came to that. But he was probably an Athenian by birth and then from pagan parentage. And yet, in his adult years is when he embraced Christian religion, and by extensive travels in both the East and West, he sought to find what were going to be the most distinguished teachers. And so he has tons of writings as well. And the writings of Clement disclose the amazingly broad scope of his knowledge of both classical and biblical literature. I mean, he has this knowledge of both classical and biblical. So he has a lot of knowledge about Grecian literature as well as biblical literature. And one finds in Clement's works of his own writings citations in all of the books of the New Testament with the exception of Philemon, James, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John. But the rest he does. On the other hand, he considered these writings not in the present New Testament of any value, of not of any real value. The Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the traditions of Matthias, the preaching of Peter, 1 Clement, Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, which a lot of people refer to even today in that doctrine, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Apocalypse of Peter. And he did not believe that they should not be viewed along with the New Testament canon at all. And I believe he was right on when it came to that. And I have some examples there as well. Clement of Alexandria. Have you heard of Origen? I think you have. Many of you have heard of Origen. Born in 185 AD, died in 263 AD. Lived a pretty good amount of years, especially for that day and time. When we talk about, by the way, we throw out this term among the anti-Nicene writers. Typically when you say ante, not anti, A-N-T-I, but A-N-T-E, having to do with post, Nicene, that, or before, not post, pre. I said that backwards, I apologize. That A-N-T-E is before. That these individuals that were writing, that were alive and writing before the Nicene Creed 325. And again, this becomes important, very relevant, because of what they were aware of, what they had available, what they wrote and what they knew long before the Council of Nice. Okay? And among the anti-Nicene writers of what was referred to as the Eastern Church, the greatest by far, many refer to as Origen, a theologian, a prolific Bible scholar. According to Eusebius, Origen was born of Christian parents in Egypt and spent most of his life in Alexandria as a teacher. He also visited Antioch, Athens, Arabia, Ephesus, and Rome. Very well traveled. Think of those days and time. And a lot of interesting information about him too. But on the Gospels, from Origen's homily on Luke, according to the Latin translation, and I find this interesting. So he's written a homily on Luke, and the Latin translation, in other words, it was written in Greek, but it was translated into Latin. And guess who translated it? Jerome. And Jerome, who would be the one responsible for what? The Latin Vulgate, the translation of the Bible in Latin. But listen to what Jerome translates. This is from Origen. That there have been written down not only 4 Gospels, but a whole series from which those that we possess have been chosen, handed down to the churches, is, let it be noted, what we may learn from Luke's preface, which runs thus: for as much as many have taken in hand to compose a narrative. That's right out of Luke 1:1-3. The expression "they have taken in hand" involves a covert accusation of those who precipitately and without grace of the Holy Ghost have set about the writing of the Gospels. I mean, that is just amazing. Matthew, to be sure, and Mark and John as well as Luke did not take in hand to write, but fulfilled with the Holy Ghost have written the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and John were eyewitnesses. Luke was not. And he acknowledges that, and that's what Luke says in Luke chapter 1. Right on target. Right on target. Origen on the book of Acts. And his testimony concerning the book of Acts is pervasive in his writings. And as would be expected, he attributes the book of Acts to Luke as the author. Origen in the Pauline epistles makes frequent citations from the Pauline epistles, including even the brief letter to Philemon, finally. Okay? And in his homilies, section 20, verse 2. And often he uses the formula, Paul says, or Paul said, and sometimes adds the name of those whom the apostle addresses. So that's interesting. Also, he quotes quite a bit from the book of Hebrews, from James, and anyway, very, very interesting about him. How many of you have heard of Tertullian? Tertullian wrote against heresy. There's some very important documents, especially the Gnostic heretics. We know that by the time we're getting into this period of time, 160, in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, Judaism is not so much a problem anymore. Not really, because what happened back in the 1st century? What happened in 70 AD? The destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, the records, and now we know that they had pretty much scattered again, but wrote against heresy, including Gnosticism. And he wrote that in baptism we are freed from our sins. From our sin. Tertullian of Carthage. And again, born in about 155, 160. And he was very, very interested in taking the gospel to Carthage, by the way, at the end of the 2nd. And it was at the end of the 2nd, well, he was born in 160, it was it was right nearly before this period of time, before he moved to Carthage, that he had been converted to Christianity. One of the heretics that he exposed was a fellow by the name of Marcion. And Marcion's name comes up a lot as a heretic. A lot of false teaching, Gnostic ideas and other false teaching. But Marcion had quite a following during this period of time. And Tertullian exposed him for what he was. Tertullian's New Testament, as he had access to New Testament, was not perceptibly different from that of the preceding period. He cites all of the books of the New Testament with the exception of 2 Peter, James, 2 John, and 3 John. And again, in fact, in the book of Acts, in course of his denunciation of the false teacher Marcion, he chides him for not accepting, because Marcion would not accept the book of Acts. See, Marcion was viewed as Christian by many, but there are a lot of the books he would not accept. He would not accept the book of Acts because it was too damaging to his own doctrine. But great information on him as well. This next fellow is of great importance too. While his background is not much is known of him, although some of his writings include no one can attain salvation without baptism. He made that, and as he was born about 170, died 235, Hippolytus. He was born in Rome as a disciple of Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp. He grew into a position of leadership. He opposed Roman bishops who modified their beliefs to accommodate these large number of pagans. Here's what was going on in the 2nd, 3rd century. As Christianity, seemingly, what was being called Christianity, was spreading, is that as they were reaching out and more pagans were being converted, what the church was doing was going ahead and accepting many of their pagan practices and beliefs because it satisfied the people. It made them very, very happy. Have you started reading The Traces of the Kingdom at all yet? Have you? Yeah, a little bit. It's fascinating. It's going to really get into that. And it's just amazing of how much when you look and say, well, why is there Easter today? Why is there Christmas today? Why is there the veneration of saints? Why is there Mariology? The whole concept comes from paganism. And as people were converted, the church would go ahead and embrace some of these things, and this became a part of the tradition of the church. That's the history, folks. It really is. He was opposed to what the Roman bishops that were modifying the gospel to accommodate that. And that's why he did what his treatise called Refutation of All Heresies. And in this expansive work, he identifies as many as 24 New Testament books. 24 New Testament books. Unfortunately, he was persecuted severely under Emperor Maximus Thrax, and exiled to Sardinia, and most likely died in the mines there. And as a result of Hippolytus's exile martyrdom, and this particular chain of custody ends without a clear next link. Although there's no doubt that there were many students, but no real identifiable students from him to kind of carry the torch, as it were. But one thing we know for sure, the canon of Scripture was already established in the early 2nd century, and as eyewitness accounts. And then we just have a couple of minutes here in Eusebius, and I wanted to get through these guys. 265, 339. Now we're getting to the time, yes, anti-Nicene, although he died relatively short period of time after the Council of Nice and the Nicene Creed in 325. But regarded as an extremely learned Christian of his time, he was excommunicated at the Council of Antioch in 325. And they had a few different councils, of course. What he's mainly known for is his ecclesiastical history, but he again is one that, with some more discoveries and records, that maybe some of his history isn't always as accurate as it should be, as far as history of certain peoples and places and so forth. But it becomes a very important work. But in his, what he called the Homologumena, and that is in the same Gospels, he refers to as the Holy Quaternion of the Gospels, of the 4 Gospels, and the book of Acts, the epistles of Paul, the epistle of John, the epistle of Peter, and on it goes. And so I have this really neat, we're out of time, section that is called, in his ecclesiastical history, but the divine scriptures that are accepted and those that are not. And he gives a list. Those that are accepted, those that should be disputed, those that are known to be spurious, those that are known to be heretical. And I mean, he goes through very detail with that information. Now, let's go back to Maya's question from 3 weeks ago. Why are we learning this stuff? And that's a good question, Maya. It really is. So, why? Why? What is the importance? Are we beginning to see the relevance of looking at these manuscripts, looking at these fragments, looking at these individuals that were historical realities? I'm going to be preaching a sermon coming up because I was online the other day and I found this site. 21 people that probably did not really exist in history. You ever seen those things? And they got the one. And guess which one it concludes with? Jesus Christ, obviously. But now, we're not sure that there ever really was a Moses. We're not really sure that there ever was an Abraham. Not really sure there was ever a Saul of Tarsus. And they're enlisting it with Johnny Appleseed and John Henry and things like that. It is just shameful. Shameful. Yeah, I'm sorry. There is some real question to Johnny Appleseed. But anyway. But I hope we understand why this is important. We got to stop. What we're going to do next week, we're looking at papyri. And so I just have some notes on the papyri that I want to go over. And we want to look at the papyri documents. Some that are anti-Nicene, some that are post, but all very, very important because of the prolific amount of the New Testament and even Old Testament that are found in the 130-odd some papyri that we have. We've got to stop. Thank you very much. We will continue, because it was five Wednesday month. So we do have class next Wednesday. We do have class next Wednesday. Okay. Bring them on in. We're done.